welcome back. And we're getting ready to move into our first segment for today as we talk about upcoming amendments to the Electricity Act and regulations. And here to explain to us exactly what is going to take place and how you can provide feedback, we have the Director of Electricity for the Public Utilities Commission, Ambrose Tillettt. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Marlene, and thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for being here to be able to share this information with us. We were having a bit of a background conversation talking about the process of being able to make these amendments, and I think that's a great launching point for the conversation. So there are essentially changes or updates that need to be made to the Electricity Act, but there's a very specific process that has to be followed. Let's talk about that.
Okay, the law provides a general framework for the sector.
Yeah.
And the law also provides that the regulator and the minister, either together or separately, may update conditions governing the environment for the sector. And so we have recognized for some time now, when I was at the ministry, for example, we recognized for some time now, one of the things we need is a licensing regime. Because the law provides for 4 license classes, and the conditions in the sector has changed, and we needed to provide for other license classes or individual licenses. In order to do that, the law says that if it's a regulation or a rule related to generation, the PUC makes a draft rule, they publish it, and they must consult with interested parties and the public for them to understand the impact of the rule.
Yeah.
Once those comments are received, the PUC then has to consider them, generally consider them, and then it finalizes the rule. If it's for any other part of the electricity sector other than generation, the PUC makes the rule under the same process, but it must be assented by the minister.
Yes.
So these rules will go through the second. These are regulations made by the commission, which must be approved by the minister.
Absolutely. And you also have the public consultation to do as well.
Which is the phase we're in.
Yeah.
The other thing that the law doesn't do it, but which the commission and the ministry has always agreed, is whenever the PUC is making a rule, the broad outlines of the rule is agreed with the ministry. Because the ministry wants to make sure that the rule, 2 things, complies with what it considers the powers under the law, and it complies with the general policy direction that the ministry would like to see, because the rules really is creating the environment, the policy environment as well. So you want to make sure that there's coherence between the policy of the ministry and the rule that the PUC is making.
So one of the things that has been done, as you mentioned very much earlier, is talking about the license regime. And obviously, as you pointed out, the landscape has changed quite a bit in Belize. And we're talking about generation of electricity from alternative sources. We've also talked about trying to be able to get the country completely self-sufficient. And while these processes and the interest in investment have been growing, the Electricity Act itself perhaps has not been able to provide full coverage and regulation for that new sector. Is that the case?
Well, yeah, as I said, the Electricity Act, specifically on the licensing regulations, the Electricity Act provides for licensing of a person, meaning any legal person, meaning a natural person or a legal person, or you can license a class of persons. And so when you look at the regulations, you will see the regulations talk about individual license. An individual license is a license you give to a natural person or to a legal person. When you see the regulations talk about a class license, it is a license that the regulations and the law provides to a swat of persons. And it really means that authorization to those people is already agreed upon.
Okay.
You simply need to meet the conditions, and then you become part of that class of licensees. So the class license is like a broad, it's really a streamlined process, while the individual process is more to make sure, because really what a license under Electricity Act, the way we understand it, is a prudential process. It's to make sure that the person who is going to either generate and supply, or transmit and supply, or distribute and supply, has both the financial and technical capacity to carry out that function.
Yeah.
But the law recognizes, and the regulations recognizes, that there are certain activities you're doing. You don't need to go through this big process of giving a notice. I plan to give an authorization. I need to review the person's financial and technical capacity. Because the activities are so small, you really don't need. It's really for the larger scale activities.
Yeah.
You need to do a prudential assessment before you approve the activity.
So let me use an example, and then you tell me if this is one of the areas that would benefit. We've been talking about utilizing solar energy, and I know you know, there's some places that have already ventured into it. Let's say I built a home and I, you know, outfit it with solar panels, and I produce excess electricity than I need. One of the questions has always been, can I sell it back to the grid? Under this new licensing regime, will I now be able to get a license to be able to sell the minimal excess that I have?
Okay. As I said, the law provides for 4 license classes.
Yeah.
The law says that if you are a person in Belize, you can generate or distribute for yourself
Yeah.
up to 75 kilowatts. And that is a right granted under the law since 1992. So currently, you do have people all over Belize who put in a 5 kilowatt generating plant, they put in a 10 kilowatt generating plant, and all they need to do is to file the technical diagrams, the wiring diagrams, the technical specifications to the commission for technical approval. But there's no need for them to go through a licensing and consent process.
Yeah.
That right is enshrined in the law. What is not enshrined in the law when it was written assumed that either you get, at that time, you either get your supply from a utility or you get supply
on your own.
On your own. What we are seeking to do in this regulation is exactly what you're saying. We're trying to create a license class now where you had power for your own use, and we believe that the power to do this comes under another part of the law which says the regulator has a duty to ensure efficient and economical operation of the electricity sector. And so what happens is that you actually have people right now who have designed a system for themselves, but there are times when they have excess. And so we see it as part of the natural evolution of the sector, not only to conform with what the international community is doing, but really it makes sense for you to have excess at some point in time.
Why waste
to
it?
be able to trade it with utility for efficient and economy. And so yes, there's going to be a license class now created to allow for that to happen. But I want to make it very clear that it is not intended to because, for example, I had a question last week from a person who saw the regulations and called and said, you know, he said, I have a little house I'm building. He said, I'm going to be using about 2 or 3 kilowatts. He said, but I want to put in a 70 kilowatt solar in my house. I said, but that is not for your own use. Your own use is if you put in a 3 kilowatt solar. If you are going to be using 3 kilowatts and putting in a 70 kilowatt supply, that is not for your own use. Most of that capacity is for public supply. And the law says, as long as you're providing electricity for public supply now, you have to get an individual license. So you can provide class licenses for people who are doing their own thing, so to speak, in lingo. But as long as you're providing power for public supply, the law is very clear. You must get an individual license, and not only attached to that is the requirement you must get an individual license, but the process must be a competitive one. So you must go through a competitive process. And then the law also provides safeguards that for people who provide public supply, that all their costs, their reasonable costs, must, because you don't want to have a situation where licensees is providing power and then they go insolvent. So the law also makes a provision to protect those licensees that as long as they are managing their business in a prudent manner, they are supposed to remain solvent. So the commission has a duty to ensure that those licensees are solvent. So you have all these conditions that relate. Once you're providing electricity for public supply, there are special considerations given to protect the sector and the public.
So if I will only produce from my own home, I don't require a license.
Up to 75 kilowatts.
Up to 75 kilowatts.
That's what the law provides. And again, we're proposing on this regulation to make some changes because, for example, there's a number of businesses, that hotels in particular, that put in standby generators. 100 kilowatts, 300 kilowatts, half a megawatt. And currently, we have never required them to do licensing and consent because it doesn't make sense. And what we're doing under this regulation is really making it lawful for those activities that we actually had ignored in the past. And under the law was unlawful, we are really saying it should be lawful. Because if you're putting in a standby generator for your business, why should I go through the process of giving notice, of making sure you have the financial and technical capacity to run? Because you're planning to run the business. It is really to protect your underlying business to give you reliable supply. So it is what it's seeking to make the sector more efficient and economical.
So I understand what you're saying to be that the importance is that once you are looking to be able to provide beyond your own necessary use with your particular caps in place, that you won't necessarily need to go through all the paperwork and all the processes as was required before. But once a person makes a decision to be able to move to a position where they want to provide to the grid, then they have to go through the processes, including the competitive bids and the financial checks that you spoke about.
That's correct.
Now, this is such a new area for Belize, and I think people are accustomed to the thought that they're big companies that must provide electricity to be able to participate in the energy generation sector. What are some of the concerns that you're hoping the regulation will be able to cover and mitigate as we venture into renewable sources of energy?
There are some important things that the regulation seeks to do. There are two of them that we have already discussed. One of them has to do with people who are putting electricity for their own use. And because of the way the law is written, which prevents them from trading with utility, from sharing with utility, exchanging with utility, we believe that that is good for the sector and for the country to allow for economic and efficient operation. We want to allow it under the regulations, and in fact, to do that, the two regulations go together. We have a licensing regulation and there's an interconnection regulation. So the interconnection regulation says as long as you become licensed under the regime, you can interconnect to BL and then you can trade. The regulations as written doesn't yet provide the commercial conditions under which that trade will take place. That is still something that we're seeking to add to the suite of regulations. But what this is doing is, from a technical standpoint and from a legal standpoint, making sure that it is possible to do it. And then, as I said, we also have license classes where people really are not using electricity for standby purposes. Another important reason we are doing these regulations is because we also recognize that there are areas they are increasingly, well, I shouldn't say increasingly, we have come to the point where traditionally the authorized area for BL is the whole country of Belize. But we know that there are some parts of the country that BL will not be able to supply in a reasonable time frame. And what we're seeing is that we've seen one or two different people who have applied for license to supply in an authorized area where BL is not going to be readily or in a timely manner providing service. A good case of that, for example, is the Farmers Light Plant system at Spanshikout. They applied for a license last year. And the problem for us is, what is a license class? So we are trying to create a license class under this regime to allow us to license them.
So if there's a Mayan community in Toledo that hasn't been electrified as yet, and one person gained, and there was a woman who traveled to learn how to set up the solar systems. They want to create their own electricity grid. from whatever source, they can now apply under these new regulations to be able to do that for their own community. And the limitations there would be that it is not readily accessible for the utility company as yet.
Yes. So so one of the reasons why we're doing these regulations is to allow for communities which do not have a public utility provider to put together either as a private or as a non-profit to provide electricity. In the case of Farmers Like Plant, for example, they act as a cooperative. We actually have the ministry is doing a pilot in La Gracia, which is going to be managed more at the village level. So you need to provide for these license classes. Either, for example, an analog of that is, for example, in the U.S. The U.S. has 3 main types of utilities. You have investor-owned, private. You have municipal-owned, which is owned by towns and cities. And you have cooperatives, which is collectively, just like a cooperative, like a credit union or another cooperative. So, again, the regulations are in trying to allow communities to have electricity supply, is seeking to provide for licensed classes that can organize themselves to provide electricity if BL is not really available.
What are some of the other new interests in terms of electricity generation or providing for a community that you've seen over the years that you hope the regulations will put us up to par? You spoke of the co-op situation.
Well, I think those are the main license classes that we are seeing. And one of the reasons for the period of consultations and comments is because we don't think that we have a monopoly on what ideas are. So I'm describing to you the general outlines of what these regulations were seeking to do was trying to, given what we have on the horizon, we're trying to create license classes to allow us to better manage the sector. Now, it may very well be, for example, that someone may have a better insight, a perspective, and may suggest other license classes that we should consider and include in the regulations.
Okay. So you are heading into your public consultation phase with what is already put together by the PUC along with the ministry. Let's just, for the sake of absolute clarity for viewers and people who are interested in the consultation, talk about what the different license classes will be, so that people can have an idea of what they'll go in to discuss at the consultation. Okay. So we had the individual first, right?
Yeah, we have, I think, let me just check my notes.
It's now 5.
Yeah, we have, we still keep the ones under the Act, the public utility provider. So we still have the license class for people who are for public utility provider, which is BL. And the law, the way we understand the law, there's only one transmission licensee that's allowed under the law. That's our understanding of the regulations. You can have more than one distribution licensee. But our reading of the law, and I mean, we at the staff, in discussing with the ministry and the commission, believe that having one transmission licensee in the country of Belize, because of the size of Belize, makes sense. But you can have more than one distribution licensee. As I said, we actually have applications, I think, for 2 other distribution licensees.
What's the difference between the transmission and the
under the law, a transmission licensee provides for the bulk transfer of power. So a transmission licensee will move power from a power station to a bulk supply point. While a distribution licensee moves power from a generating stations to individual customers, or from a bulk supply point to individual customers. So so BL will really be the only transmission licensee, but there may be consideration given for other distribution licensees. I may also want to point out that we didn't get an application. We had an interest in a party who is in BL's authorized area of supply. But the community is very, very small. And when I raised the issue with the commission, there seems to be some skepticism as to whether or not a community that small should really apply for a distribution license. So I think these are, as I said, as we are moving along, we realize that we need to make sure that we are clear on the license class and the criteria and the conditions under which you will agree to provide a license, or conditions when you may object or the commission may decide, you know what, this license in the overall scheme of things doesn't make sense for the country of Belize, so we will not grant you that license.
Yeah. Now, I know we have to go through the different differentiation of licenses, but before we get to that, how does the PUC assess these particular interests that come in? Because let's be honest, we are living in 2017, and it is unbelievable that we still have communities that do not have a regular supply of electricity. I think most of us who have lived in more urban areas cannot fathom living by candlelight in a community or whatever it is. How do you ensure that you are not, because of increased regulations or because of specific incidents like you spoke of just now, BEL has access but the people aren't electrified, that you're ensuring that people are still getting the type of services that they're supposed to get or that they deserve, really?
Well, as I said, I think we believe that one of the reasons that we have had at this point a significant, material part of the country where there's not electricity, I think has to do with two issues. One, we believe that the enabling environment, this licensing regime, is a barrier, but it's not the principal barrier. Our belief is that the principal barrier actually was more economic and technical. And the good news is that the advance and evolution of solar has now made it possible for what was 10 years ago very difficult, economically. Technically it was possible, but economically it was very difficult. With the evolution of solar, both from its performance and pricing, you can now provide affordable, accessible electricity to large groups of people, especially in the case of Belize, where lots of cases, the intensity of demand, the level of demand is very low. And so we believe that the technology evolution and the pricing changes over time now makes it possible, and we believe that having the enabling environment will be another part of that whole scheme to improve the enabling environment.
Okay.
And then of course the third thing is that the government of Belize is in the process of negotiating with the EU funds which will be used to provide for these communities to get access. So in our lingo we say we are trying to line up all our ducks to get to that position where by the end of this decade most parts of this country have modern energy services. I mean, it is something that we can't go into the next decade with that kind of mark on our development. It's very important because if you don't have modern energy services, you're really telling people that they will remain in poverty for another generation, and that is unacceptable.
Okay. So let's move back to
the license
classes. Yeah, I want people to understand, so when they come to the public consultation, they know what questions they'll have. So we spoke of the transmission, distribution. As I said, some of these are simpler repetition of the act because we want to have a complete regulation. So you have a individual license, which is your public utility supplier, which would BL, for example, is such a licensee, which is somebody who both transmits and distributes. And then you have the IPPs, which are the privately held generators who provide power almost exclusively for public supply. And in most cases, what BL has is a contract with them, which they call buy all, sell all. So they produce everything for BL to supply, and then BL. Like your Bagas and some of the others,
Well, Bagas is a little different, and that's the second license class. You have license class, say like the hydros, for example, where they buy all, sell all. And then you have another license class, which is a substantial amount of your power is for your own use, but also a substantial amount of your power is for sale, which is like your bagasse license class. And then there's the cooperative license, which is where communities, which is to allow communities that want, which are not in which want to have their own authorized supply. For example, farmers like plant or a village that is not connected to the grid would like to create a legal person of the community to be able to supply themselves. So those are the license class that, the individual license classes that we are proposing. There may be some others that people may feel that we may have missed, and we would want to hear from interested parties and from the public. Then the class license, as I said, the one that we immediately looked at is the situation where you're just providing power for standby purposes. And then the second license class is the one you mentioned, which is where you're providing power for own use. But you are at some point in the way you're using it, you are throwing away energy. And so that person is allowed to interconnect to BL and to trade so that their own little generator that they have is more efficient. But remember, the conditions for that is there are two criteria. One, it's for your own use. It is not intended for
primarily
you to,
for your own use.
It is not intended for you to bypass the public process. And two, it must be less than 75 kilowatts, which is what the cap, which is set by the law.
A generation of less than 75 kilowatt.
So those are the license classes that we have proposed so far. As I said, these are not the only ones that may be in the final regulations. We would like to hear from the public and interested parties to see whether they may have a perspective which would improve on these regulations.
So when are the public consultations going to be held?
Well, the deadline for comments is, I believe, we started this process in May. And the deadline, because the law says you must give at least 28 days notice. And the deadline was the 9th of June. And we got no comments from no one. And so we discussed with the commission, the Staff Constitution Commission. We said this can't be. Something this consequential requires. And so we decided to give another 28 days. And this time we're actually now we know that people in Belize tend to communicate more orally, visually.
People will know more about it.
No one will. People don't seem to take time to read these stuff in the newspapers and on the website. So the hope is that this conversation with this morning will trigger people's interest in reading what the regulations are. See the classes we're proposing, how the process that we're proposing for people to apply for these licenses. How do you propose to make people comply with the license conditions? The fees we're charging for people to apply for these licenses or to get these licenses. We want to know from people whether the whole scheme that we're proposing can be improved. That is the process of this.
There are no fees included in generating for your own consumption?
We are proposing to charge a small fee, yes.
What's a small fee?
I think, let me see.
Small is a very relative term.
Let me see. You mean the class license?
No, if I want to be able to generate from my own home, I need an individual class license.
I think it's $20.
Okay, that's affordable.
Yeah.
So you've consulted me on that one.
No, but I mean, you need to look at the whole regulations to see.
And I think obviously you want to ensure safety as well. You don't want ad hoc systems put in place, or you don't want people to kind of just go rogue and figure out their own way of doing things. It has to be a regulated industry as long as it's not over-regulated as well. So your deadline now for
it's the 14th of July.
The 14th of July. And how do people respond with comments?
You can make written comments, you can mail us your comments, or you can email, you can send it electronically. We actually prefer it electronically, of course. But if you are still in the ages where you like pen and paper, you can send us in.
Maybe they don't have electricity at home, so they have to come to you and tell you personally.
But we really, really want to hear. But I think also, I felt it was important for people to understand what the state of the law is. Because it gives them a more informed when they read the regulations, they get a better sense as to what is it we're seeking to achieve and how they can improve on these regulations as they are written at this time.
Okay. So will there be an official consultation, or it's simply open for comments?
It's open for comments at this time. I believe after the July the 14th, the commission will then decide what to do next. One of the things that my office will do is put together all these comments, and I guess when somebody makes a comment, I guess as the staff we will probably make comments on the comments, and we send it to the commission, and the commission will then need to bring this all together into a finalized rule, which they will then have to decide how to proceed. The law does provide that the commission has a number of avenues. The commission can have a public hearing on the rule before they finalize it, or they can just issue another draft final for comments.
Okay.
So the commission will have to decide what next.
Yeah.
At this
but
point,
what you want first is the feedback.
Is the feedback, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for coming in and clearly explaining what the new regulations will include and how it will impact individual users and those who have interest in moving.
And bear in mind that this licensing regime also has attached to it an interconnection, because as I said, in most cases, not all cases, some of these licensees would want to connect to BL.
Yeah.
And so there's an interconnection regulation which basically says BL, you have to provide, as long as the PUC license somebody, you need to interconnect them. And then there are ways in which BL must work along with these licensees.
Okay. So thank you for coming in and sharing that. I'm sure that's going to be one that you'll hear from the companies themselves. But the 14th of July is the deadline for comments on the proposed regulations, and you can contact the PUC. You're on Facebook. You have a website and phone number and email, so people can contact you there. Thank you.
Marlene, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about self-care for those in the teaching profession. So stay tuned.
Okay, great.